Okay, so what if growth isn't measured just by, how big something gets, but by its capacity to, to give things away,
Yeah.
like release its most valuable stuff?
That feels pretty counterintuitive, right? I mean, usually we think success is about getting more.
Totally. Bigger numbers, bigger budget.
Sugar buildings, yeah.
It flips the script.
Yeah.
And that radical idea, well, it's really at the heart of the source material you've brought us for today's deep dive. We're digging into these articles and notes, and they focus on this crucial phase the sources call reproducing, strengthening, and sending.
Yeah, this dive is really all about understanding that shift, moving from just building up one single entity, and yeah, the sources are talking about churches here,
Right.
to actually successfully reproducing new ones. And crucially, why that multiplication, according to this material, is just non-negotiable for making a broader impact.
Okay. So our mission today in this deep dive is to pull out those core ideas driving this whole thing. Look at the surprising, maybe even counterintuitive convictions they highlight. Explore the practical steps and, find those key nuggets of knowledge that the sources say make successful reproduction really possible.
We're going to navigate these notes and articles together specifically for you, the listener.
Okay, let's jump right in then. The foundational concept, multiplication as DNA.
Yeah, the sources make a really strong case here. They argue reproduction isn't some, advanced program you tack on later.
Once you're big enough.
Exactly. It's got to be woven into the very fabric right from the beginning, happening at every level.
Okay, so not just planting whole churches way down the road.
No. It starts way smaller. Disciples making new disciples, leaders raising up new leaders, small groups or cells reproducing themselves. It's presented as a fundamental biological principle, built in from day one.
And the material's clear on the why behind this.
Oh, yeah. Multiplication leads to just exponentially greater impact for the kingdom, reaching new people, new places.
Think about it, a single entity, no matter how huge.
It hits a ceiling eventually.
Right.
Limited reach. Reproduction breaks through those limits.
The sources present it as natural, healthy, living things reproduce.
And something they definitely attribute to God's design and desire. They point out it can look different too.
Like how?
Well, planting daughter churches nearby, or maybe pioneer churches way out in distant areas, or even just collaborating with partners who are already doing planting.
And the biblical grounding, that's a big theme here.
Huge. The sources point straight to the church at Antioch in Acts 13, sending out Barnabas and Paul.
They're key leaders.
Exactly. And they also highlight Acts 9.31, where it explicitly says the churches in Judea were multiplied, not just individual believers.
Oh, that's an interesting distinction the sources make.
Yeah, it's a significant detail they emphasize, focusing on the multiplication of the entity, the church itself.
Not just growing bigger in one spot.
Right. And they show how the church in Ephesus, you see it in Acts 19, Colossians, Revelation wasn't just one massive church.
It was a hub.
Kind of, yeah. It became a mother church that sparked a whole cluster of churches across Asia Minor.
Okay, now you mentioned this next part gets really fascinating and challenging.
Yeah, because the sources spend a lot of time on what they call counterintuitive convictions.
Counterintuitive convictions.
Okay, these are described as the absolutely essential beliefs that shift reproduction from feeling like this heavy obligation
into a real passion.
Exactly. And the sources stress these go against our natural wiring. They have to be taught and lived out constantly.
All right, I'm ready. Hit me with the first one.
Okay, first up, success is defined by impact, not size.
Ooh, okay, right away we're hitting that counterintuitive theme. But hang on. Doesn't size help impact? A huge church can run big programs, reach lots of local people.
The sources definitely acknowledge that. A large entity can have significant immediate impact, for sure. But they argue that smaller entities that multiply consistently, well, they have the potential for far greater total impact over time.
How so?
Precisely because they touch more lives in more places. It's about diffusion, spreading out, not just concentrating everything in one spot.
So growing bigger in one place is fine, it's good even, but the vision for reproduction needs to be, bigger than just being the biggest church on the block.
Yeah, it has to include depth and multiplication. It's not just about gathering people in, it's about generating new centers of life.
Which leads us, I guess, to the second conviction. You said maybe the most challenging one.
Possibly, yeah. Growth is measured by the capacity to release, not retain.
This is the idea we started with. This demands real sacrifice, doesn't it?
It really does.
You're talking about intentionally sending away significant resources, people, money, leaders, to something new that Well, it won't directly benefit the mothership, at least not right away.
Exactly. Giving that away feels costly. And it does leave gaps in the short term. The sources are really honest about that.
So how is it possible?
They say this kind of sacrifice is only possible if you are just profoundly convinced that growth is actually measured by your ability to reproduce and the kingdom impact that follows.
Not by your Sunday attendance or your building size or the annual budget numbers.
Bingo.
The go-to example from the sources is Antioch again, right? Releasing Barnabas and Paul.
Yeah, Acts 13. These were like their top guys. Imagine losing your best people.
It's hard to picture.
But the sources highlight the incredible joy later in Acts 14 when they came back reporting all the fruit the churches planted. That return on spiritual investment made the sacrifice totally worth it.
And there's a quote in there.
Yeah, from Milford Minutrea. Measure growth by capacity to release, not retain.
Simple but powerful.
And then he takes it a step further. He distinguishes between addition and multiplication. He says, releasing members to start new churches is addition. Releasing members to starting churches results in movements.
Church starting churches. That's the key to exponential growth.
That's where it really takes off, according to the sources.
And they're careful to say this releasing focus doesn't mean the original church can't grow big itself.
Right. They point to examples of churches that do grow large while consistently planting. The definition of success just shifts,
From size to obedience, kingdom impact.
Yeah. Impact through multiplication, which they argue absolutely requires selflessness and, faith.
And faith is the cornerstone of the third conviction.
Spot on. Acting in faith is prudent, not seeking security.
Okay, unpack that. Releasing resources takes faith. Trusting God will provide for the new thing and fill the gap back home.
Precisely. Our default, our human nature is security control. We want to hold on.
Makes sense.
But the sources suggest that chasing that security can, ironically, cut you off from your spiritual lifeline, that dependency on God.
They mentioned Laodicea.
Yeah, Revelation 3. They felt rich, secure, self-sufficient, but were spiritually bankrupt. Steps of faith, on the other hand, force you back into dependency on Him.
But it's not reckless faith.
No, they draw a careful line there. This isn't a call for foolish leaps. They joke about bungee jumping without a cord. But they argue, look, if a church has seen God's blessing, experienced growth in earlier phases, then taking a step to release resources for reproduction, that's actually a reasonable act of faith, not irrational.
And they use Jesus' parables here. Mustard seed, yeast.
Yeah, Matthew 13. The tiny seed becoming huge, the hidden yeast leavening the whole batch. The results of these faith steps, they note, are often supernatural, way out of proportion to the initial effort.
So trusting God for that kind of outcome is seen as prudent foresight, not just blind optimism.
That's the argument. Okay, moving to number 4. Begin with multiplying disciples and leaders, not programs or institutions.
This circles back to that DNA idea.
Totally.
So the sources are saying the real engine isn't the fancy building or the slick program.
Nope, it's reproducing spiritual life at the most basic level.
Discipleship.
Exactly. Basic discipleship, people growing, learning to share their faith, that's the absolute foundation. They quote Neil Cole's progression here.
Which is?
If you can't reproduce disciples, you can't reproduce leaders. If you can't reproduce leaders, you can't reproduce churches. And if you can't reproduce churches, you can't reproduce movements.
That lays it out pretty clearly. You can't multiply what you haven't first produced.
Makes sense, right?
Yeah. The sources seem to be saying if you skip or skimp on that discipleship piece, any attempt at church planting is going to be weak, anemic maybe, or just fail.
Which flows right into the 5th conviction. Simple beginnings, not big budgets and large numbers.
Okay, this one really challenges the common wisdom, right? That you need to be rich or huge before you can even think about planting.
And the sources are pretty blunt about it. They say entities that wait for that magic number, that certain size or huge budget surplus.
They almost never actually plant anything.
Pretty much. They're always pressing local needs, right? And the required threshold just keeps creeping up over time. It's never quite enough.
So what's the alternative?
The material points out that reproducing entities, well, they just find creative ways to plant without needing deep pockets or massive crowds. They highlight grassroots movements, even in Western places.
There was that study in France.
Yeah, Robert Voshko's study in Grenoble. Really striking. One church planted 6 daughter churches over 6 years.
Without giving any extra funds from the mother church budget. How?
How is that possible? Well, often by relying heavily on lay leaders, maybe bivocational pastors who earn their own living, using cheap or free places to meet homes, parks, borrowed spaces. Creativity is huge.
Like sharing pastors.
Yeah.
Or using retired folks.
Yeah, they mentioned sharing a pastor between two churches or retired pastors helping get things started, like that Munich Rail example illustrates. Vashko's conclusion is powerful, basing multiplication decisions on money. It ultimately stops church planting.
Wow. So the money isn't the key enabler.
Yeah.
It can actually be the obstacle if you make it one. That's a definite flip.
It is.
The sources mention needing a critical mass, but that it varies a lot.
Right, depending on the model. Maybe under 20 for a simple house church. 40 if lay leaders need to cover minimal rent.
100 maybe for a paid pastor in a building.
Versus 100, 200 plus for those big attractional models, which honestly most churches just can't pull off. The average church is smaller than 200.
So the core message here is that reproduction always takes a step of faith that stretches you.
Always. It's vision and faith that define reproducing churches, according to these sources, not their size or their bank account.
Okay, last one of these counterintuitive convictions. Messy and unpredictable, not neat and calculable. So planning is good, but don't expect the plan to go, well, according to plan.
Pretty much. The sources are anti-planning. They definitely encourage it, but they inject a big dose of reality. Expect surprising breakthroughs, yes, but also expect unexpected setbacks.
And opposition.
Oh, yeah.
No.
Spiritual, governmental, even religious opposition is often part of the package.
Like Paul in Ephesus, that verse they quote, 1 Corinthians 16:9.
A great door for effective work has opened to me, and there are many who oppose me. Yeah. The sources are saying opportunity and opposition often arrive together.
Makes sense. New people joining bring challenges.
Brokenness, complex needs, yeah. Division can flare up. The early church faced all of this. But, crucially, they also experienced God's power and grace through it all.
So you need flexibility.
Absolutely. Stay committed to the core vision, but you got to respond creatively to what actually happens on the ground.
They use Paul's journeys again here, right? Trying to go one way, God sends them another.
Yeah, Acts 16. Tried for Asia and Bithynia, got redirected to Macedonia. Sometimes the door you thought was strategic slams shut, and a totally unexpected one opens up.
And Philippi, that first Macedonian church, illustrates the simple and messy thing.
Beautifully. Started with just a few women praying by a river, immediately faced intense opposition, legal trouble.
But it became this vital, loving partner church for Paul later on.
Exactly. Philippians 4 shows that deep bond. The sources emphasize that even the best plans have to be held loosely, open to the Holy Spirit's leading, ready to adapt to circumstances, however messy they look at first.
Ooh, okay, that's a lot to chew on with those 6 convictions. It really feels like a call to a completely different way of thinking about, well, organizational health and growth.
It fundamentally shifts the paradigm, doesn't it? And having sort of grounded ourselves in that mindset, maybe let's pivot now to the practical work outlined in the sources for this phase.
The strengthening and sending phase.
Right.
Okay, enough mindset shifts for a sec. Let's get practical. The sources admit this is hard work. There's a real temptation, maybe after earlier efforts, to just coast, settle into maintenance mode.
Yeah, avoiding that lethargy is crucial. So the first task they highlight is sustain evangelistic thrust.
Keep the outward focus sharp.
Exactly. The vision needs constant refreshing. This means ongoing teaching, casting the vision for reaching out, creating opportunities, training people, celebrating testimonies.
And they put a special emphasis on testimonies from new believers.
They do. Why specifically new believers?
Yeah, why them?
Well, the sources argue they're often the most effective evangelists. Their faith is fresh, right? Their testimony is compelling because the change is recent.
Okay.
And crucially, they still have a strong network of non-Christian friends, family, colleagues. They haven't usually retreated into a Christian bubble yet.
They still speak the language.
Exactly. They speak the language of the culture around them. So equipping and mobilizing them is vital, and they often make ideal candidates for the teams sent out to start new plants.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, second task. Prepare the church for reproduction.
Vision isn't accidental, the sources say. Leadership has to be really proactive, really intentional in cultivating it.
They mentioned that time release vision idea, Schindler.
Yeah, Dietrich Schindler. Setting a date for the next church plant early on, maybe even before the current one is fully launched or stable.
Keeps the momentum going, prevents the vision fading.
Right. And the sources stress the need to continually teach on the spiritual needs out there, the Great Commission, stepping out in faith. God's heart for everyone.
And ask hard questions.
Yeah, they suggest leaders prayerfully consider things like, why biblically should we do this? Is the timing right? What obstacles will we likely face? How do we mobilize people, resources? What specific steps of faith does this require now?
And covering it all in prayer, expecting opposition, maybe even using Bible studies like Joshua or Nehemiah to prepare people.
Yes, prayer and preparation are critical, especially, they note, for the first reproduction effort.
Why the first one especially?
Because if that first one goes reasonably well, the sources say it builds huge momentum and confidence for future plants. But if it really struggles or fails...
it can create negativity that's hard to overcome later. Makes sense.
Okay, task 3. Determine location and approach. These are linked, the sources say.
Location first.
Yeah.
Local or distant?
Right. Local could be like a daughter plant nearby, or maybe splitting off from a cell group. Pioneer means going somewhere more distant, often less reached.
For pioneer plans, they reference back to earlier planning steps, identifying the community, building a team.
Exactly. And they highlight that pioneer plans often start organically, almost accidentally sometimes.
How so?
Like when members just move for work or family, they become the seed for something new, much like those believers scattered from Jerusalem in Acts 8 and 11.
Or having relatives or friends in new places can open doors, especially where outsiders might struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. For local plans, it can be simpler, like mapping where members live, see any clusters in an area without many churches.
Or existing cell groups could become the core.
Right. Assessing community needs is also key. Prioritizing areas with few churches, or maybe fast-growing neighborhoods where members are moving anyway. That Munich Rail example again.
Or targeting specific social needs, like that Manila Squatter District example they gave.
Yeah, where a church partnered with missionaries, bringing practical help alongside the gospel message.
And then the approach, how you actually do it.
The sources say, prayerfully consider different models, house church, or maybe multi-site, whatever fits the context, but always keep that long-term goal of a multiplying movement in mind.
Context matters.
Hugely. What works one place might totally bomb somewhere else. And they also recommend thinking regionally, collaborating with partners for synergy and, well, unity.
Okay, task 4, launch the plant. What does that look like on the ground, according to the sources?
For a typical daughter plant, the team often starts with members already living out in that target area. Then you recruit others who catch the vision.
They meet regularly, pray, plan.
Yeah, prayer, planning, team building. Identifying capable leadership is obviously vital. You might need to recruit skilled leaders if they aren't already there.
And the mother church leaders help out, coaching, assisting.
Yes, they assist, but the sources really stress the need to prepare new leaders specifically for multiplication, often coached by someone who's planted before.
And then it starts. Outreach, worship.
Yeah, the new work begins with outreach and worship right there in the community, often building towards a public launch or maybe a commissioning service back at the mother church. They mention specific resources available, especially in North America, to guide this.
And pioneer plants are generally tougher.
Usually, yeah.
Yeah.
The planter and team often have to physically move, find jobs, housing. It can involve more research if the place is unfamiliar.
And how does that planter role evolve over time?
Yeah. The sources describe this apostolic church planter role. They gradually phase out of leading that first church they planted.
Handing it over to local leaders.
Exactly. So they can then move on to help the next plant, either by planting it directly or coaching the new planters. This cycle repeats.
And that's how you get a movement.
That's the idea.
Oh.
The sources say a movement is truly multiplying when you start seeing third, maybe even fourth generation churches planting. That shows the DNA is really embedded, not just dependent on the original person.
Okay. Task 5. Send cross-cultural missionaries. So the vision has to go beyond just the local area, to the whole world.
Absolutely. The sources are clear. Even a young church can, and maybe should, cultivate this desire to see the gospel reach the unreached globally.
How do you stimulate that vision?
Things like having visiting missionaries share, maybe going on short-term trips, consistent teaching on global needs, and really importantly, praying for workers, Matthew 9.38, gets highlighted.
Pray the Lord of the harvest.
Right. And praying specifically that God would raise up global workers from within their own congregation.
And the actual sending part
Can be done through established mission agencies, with support from the church and others. Or the sources mention increasingly through bivocational means.
People using their jobs, business's mission.
Yeah, or strategies like that Filipino diaspora model, where believers working abroad become catalysts for new faith communities.
And sending is seen as a sign of maturity.
Yes, and really full participation in the global body of Christ, moving from maybe being on the receiving end of mission to being a sender. And the sources describe it as a source of tremendous joy for the church that sends.
Okay, final task. Participate in common efforts with other churches. The sources caution against going it totally alone.
Definitely. They warn against the spirit of isolated independence. You look at Paul, he linked the churches he planted.
So partnerships are important. Networks, associations.
Vital, the sources argue, collaborating on things like training, sending efforts, media outreach. Single churches rarely have all the resources or perspective to sustain multiplication by themselves.
And these partnerships help with unity too.
Exactly. They see them as reflecting Jesus' prayer for unity in John 17. It's about fellowship and cooperation, not necessarily rigid structural union.
And they caution against only planting among people just like you.
Yeah, avoiding ethnocentrism. They urge churches to be kingdom strategic in their planting, thinking broadly, not just evangelistically strategic within one narrow group.
Do these alliances actually help multiplication happen?
The sources argue strongly that yes, they do. That Vashko study in France, again, it found churches actively involved in fellowships or movements reproduced at a significantly higher rate.
Synergy, mutual encouragement.
Yeah, and accountability, too. Associations can provide this crucial second level of leadership encouragement, challenge, helping churches stay faithful to the vision, maybe even helping resolve conflicts, resisting the potential for one leader to dominate everything.
Her regional planting center is mentioned as strategic.
Yeah, or a training center. But there's a caution, too.
About bureaucracy.
Exactly. A necessary caution. Structures can become ends in themselves, heavy and bureaucratic. They argue structures should ideally grow organically, from the needs and vision bubbling up from the local churches, requiring real trust and respect among the leaders involved.
So we've hit the core idea, those really challenging convictions, the practical tasks. Let's just quickly circle back to that specific role you mentioned earlier, the apostolic church planter.
Right.
The sources model this on Paul, establishing local leaders and then moving on. That sounds hard.
It is. Luke describes Paul and the Ephesian elders feeling like they were, quote, torn ourselves away in Acts 21. The planter is like a spiritual parent, right? Nurturing a child to maturity and then having to let go.
So the key is staying connected, but not hovering.
Precisely. Maintain contact, absolutely, but with enough distance so the local leaders can genuinely step up and lead. The sources list healthy ways: prayer, letters, maybe occasional financial help if needed, sharing resources, visits, training partnerships.
And the planter's work isn't actually done.
No, not at all. They move on to keep being a multiplier. Their options, according to the sources, include maybe recruiting and leading a new pioneer plant somewhere else.
Or equipping others.
Yeah, investing in equipping the next generation of planters through mentoring, training, developing materials, or maybe helping with the broader movement infrastructure, but usually after many churches have already been planted.
So they become a memory for that specific church they started.
But they remain a multiplier in the bigger picture, reproducing themselves, helping the whole movement grow.
That's a helpful distinction the sources draw.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, the sources briefly summarize some qualities found in churches that actually do this reproducing thing well, referencing a case study with like 14 traits.
Yeah, things we've touched on. Having that strong vision for reproduction, being willing to take risks, being self-giving.
Growing, sensitive to the spirit, not letting money be the main driver.
Intentionally developing new leaders, having that Pauline move-on vision, targeting receptive areas, being creative, having clear principles. It's kind of a summary list of the characteristics you see, according to the sources, in places that really embed that multiplication DNA and live out those tough convictions.
Okay, wow, that was a really thorough unpacking.
Mm-hmm.
We've gone all the way from that fundamental idea, multiplication as DNA.
Right.
Explored those really challenging, counterintuitive mindset shifts. Success is impact, not size. Growth is releasing, not retaining. Faith is prudent. Life before programs. Start simple, embrace the mess.
That was a big chunk.
Yeah. And then we walked through the practical tasks. Sustaining evangelism, preparing the church, figuring out location and approach, actually launching, sending globally, and collaborating with others.
And touch on that planter role, too.
Right. It certainly offers a very different perspective on growth
Yeah.
and success than what we often see or maybe just assume.
It really does. It feels less about building one static monument and much more about cultivating this dynamic, self-generating ecosystem, doesn't it?
Exactly. So for you listening, whether you're directly involved in this kind of context or maybe just curious about how dynamic movements grow and spread, these principles from the sources definitely challenge conventional wisdom.
They offer a really powerful alternative lens to look through when you think about growth and success and even faith itself.
Definitely.
And maybe based on that strong emphasis in the sources, the focus on releasing resources, taking those steps of faith, here's a final thought for you to consider as you wrap up this deep dive with us. If true growth, according to this material, is fundamentally measured by your capacity to release resources rather than just hoard them, what resource, maybe even the one you value most right now, might you need to prayerfully consider letting go of for the sake of a greater multiplied impact down the road?